Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation for the final project in this class. I am Jack Wanik, and I will be doing my presentation on sports broadcasters and the history of them and their influence throughout the years. Without further ado, let's get started. So, we're going to start with the 1936 Olympics. The reason we're starting here is because it was the first televised Olympics. Now, think of Olympic coverage today. It's this huge thing, all major networks are covering it. It's the Olympics. What more can I say? Now, it's important to look back at the 36 Olympics because, well, it was the first. It was a new endeavor in terms of television broadcasting. Before, you really hadn't had many major sporting events of this caliber. And now that the Olympics were being covered, it set the precedent for every major event, such as the Super Bowl, the NBA Finals, the World Series, you name it. The 36 Olympics was vital in the start of it all. It forever changed the world of sports as we know it. Now, Kansas versus Missouri. You might be wondering what these two teams have to do with anything here. Well, in 1911, Kansas played Missouri in a football game that was the first public sports broadcast of its nature. Now, a company by the name of Western Union laid down a telegraph line, and then the teams played the game, as you do, and then the results were reported and recreated using graphs in a live time. Now, let's go with local. The man on your screen you might recognize if you're from the Detroit area is legendary sports broadcaster Ernie Harwell. Ernie Harwell worked for the Tigers for a very long time, and he is remembered very well to this day for his iconic calls. Now, I interviewed a man by the name of Jeff Yermak. He has been a sports fan for his entire life, and he mentioned the two biggest influences as to why he thinks so highly of sports broadcasters are Ernie Harwell and George Kell, another former Tigers broadcaster. Now, he said that what you really look for in terms of a good sports broadcaster is, quote, like they're there with you. They provide that comfort and the ability to talk with you and not at you, which is something that he said was very huge in it. Now, there are things that a sports broadcaster can do that can be remembered not so highly. He said that the biggest thing was don't play the referee. He said that the officiating needs to be left to the officials, and that if you're on commentary and you keep calling out the refs and call out what should be called, for example, if a basketball commentator were to say that should have been a charge instead of a block, well, he said that as a listener, you don't want to hear that because it's not your say. He said that if you want to control the game, put on the stripes. Now we're going to go to Kurt Gowdy. Some of you might not know who this is, but I assure you he is very, very important to the history of sports broadcasting. Now, Kurt Gowdy started his career with the New York Yankees, the legendary baseball team, and then moved to the Boston Red Sox. Yes, you heard that right. He went from the Yankees to the Red Sox in a move that I'm pretty sure is illegal in a couple states. And then from there, he built up a large following in the Boston area. He became a huge legend at a local level. Well, then NBC came calling. As you can see on his jacket, he is wearing an NBC Sports thing because he eventually signed with NBC Sports and became their biggest sports broadcaster. It was a move that wasn't really done at the time. Most people were stuck to the local level, and Gowdy built up this huge following, and then he moved to the NBC level, went national, and it was never before seen, but continues to be replicated to this day. Now, he went for the national level, and he started covering the Super Bowl for NBC when they had the rights as opposed to CBS, who also fought for the rights at the time. Now, Kurt Gowdy was the voice of many iconic Super Bowl moments in its early days. And therefore, people remember fondly Kurt Gowdy, and they remember the Super Bowl days because of him and his iconic moments. Now we're going to talk about my personal favorite sports broadcaster in history, the legendary Chick Hearn. Now, if you don't know who Chick Hearn is, it's because you're probably not a Laker fan. Chick Hearn was the legendary voice of the Los Angeles Lakers through their dynasty eras of the 1980s, known as the Showtime Lakers, a term that was coined by Chick Hearn. Now, this was far from the only thing that Chick Hearn did in terms of coining phrases. If you ever heard the phrases airball, slam dunk, or dribble drive, you have heard the voice of Chick Hearn, as he is credited for the invention of those three terms in his career as a sports broadcaster. Now, if you look at the NBA in the 80s, you had the names the Lakers, the Celtics, the Pistons, the 76ers, teams of that nature, mostly Lakers and Celtics. Now, people loved the Lakers at the time because of A. Magic Johnson, B. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and C. James Worthy. But the unsung hero of those teams was Chick Hearn. The reason that Chick Hearn is so remembered is he was so colorful on commentary. He had iconic calls like airball, slam dunk. These are such common terms that you take for granted now, but they were invented by a sports broadcaster. You go to any basketball park in the country where people are playing, and they will know the terms, but many of them don't know who Chick Hearn is or even that he invented them. If you look at Chick Hearn's career in terms of ratings, the NBA ratings were through the roof in the 80s. Yes, that can be credited to the tremendous rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, but it also can be credited to the commentators at the time who brought the game to real life. Now for a more modern example, let's go no farther than possibly the most controversial sports broadcaster in the current game, Colin Cowherd. Now, Colin Cowherd started his career off working in local Las Vegas markets. And then he moved on to become one of the biggest hosts for ESPN, the sports juggernaut that we all know today. Colin Cowherd was very successful for ESPN, and he had a very successful show. But then Fox Sports 1 came calling. For those of you who don't know who Fox Sports 1 is, Fox Sports 1 is the big rival of ESPN to this day. It's a young upstart corporation that is beginning to get really good ratings. Now, Colin Cowherd and Skip Bayless is the other person who jumped ship from ESPN to Fox Sports. And when they did it, they saw Fox Sports 1's ratings go through the roof in comparison to ESPN at the time. In his book called You Heard Me, Colin Cowherd talks about sports legendary broadcasters of the past, such as the legendary Curt Gowdy. Colin Cowherd is sort of a modern classic in that he draws influences from the previous greats and creates it in his own light.
Angie Dundee, Ali's trainer, right next to me is saying it. You may hear him. Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! The heavyweight champion is taking the mandatory 8 count, and Foreman is as poised.
Down goes Frazier. Perhaps the single most iconic line in sports history. George Foreman knocked out Frazier in one of the most incredible moments in sports history. People to this day still remember it as the legendary moment that it was. But do you think that people would remember it if had that line, down goes Frazier, not been such a huge thing? My answer is no. People think of this moment and they hear the audio, down goes Frazier, playing in their head. It is a very important part of the memory. You have the video of watching the incredible knockdown, but you also need the audio to remember what exactly it was. You remember in that moment. Jeff Yermak, the gentleman I interviewed earlier, he mentioned that when Kirk Gibson hit the 1984 home run in the World Series, he mentioned that that call was the most iconic thing he can remember in sports. Not the home run itself, not any other moment in Detroit, nay, sports history. He remembers the call. That is the power of sports broadcasting. Guys like Chick Hearn, Colin Cowherd, George Gowdy, Ernie Harwell, George Kell, these guys deserve to be remembered in the exact same light that some of the legends, like your Magic Johnsons, like your Michael Jordans, your Babe Ruths, they are just as important to the sports viewership as the actual athletes themselves. Well, that is all I have for you today. I thank you very much for listening, and I want you to remember, of all else, if you remember nothing else from my presentation, remember, sports broadcasters are the ones who let you know what's happening, and they are the ones who should be remembered just as much as the athletes themselves. Whether it's Gowdy, whether it's Colin Cowherd, whether it's Chick Hearn, you will remember these guys in the same light that the athletes do. And sports as we know it today would not be anywhere near as good and memorable if it wasn't for the sportscasters themselves who help out everyone. Thank you very much.